Ahorra más con Lowe's y lleva cada proyecto al siguiente nivel. Ahorra 15% en una selección de puertas de entradas e interiores personalizadas. Además, ahorra $80 en un kit de 2 herramientas de Wolf de 20 voltios max por $169. Y en el Pro Desk de Lowe's trae tu lista de materiales escrita o en una foto y recibe una cotización en minutos. Agiliza tus proyectos mientras sigues ahorrando con Lowe's. Válido hasta 7/8 hasta agotar existencia. Selección varía por lugar.
Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, about whether Iran has won the war against the U.S. and how exactly President Trump came to the mistaken belief that the Iranian regime would collapse. And then we break down the Pentagon's move to appoint a drone czar and the apparent China-backed effort to stop new data centers in America. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. Happy 4th of July weekend to everyone listening here in the United States. A slightly different format this week as my colleague Vaughn Cockayne and I have a lengthy interview coming up with Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute, all about the U.S.-Iran war, how the U.S. apparently miscalculated the strength and the staying power of the regime in Tehran, and why Iran believes it's won the conflict. We go really deep into basically all aspects of the U.S.-Iran war, so stay tuned for that because I can almost guarantee you will learn something during that conversation because I certainly did. Alex is a wealth of knowledge on Iran and a lot of other subjects. But first things first, there are a few other things on my radar. One big one, and that's the move by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to essentially create a drone czar inside the Pentagon. Now, this isn't entirely a surprise, right? I mean, we've had a National Defense Authorization Act that's making its way through the Senate right now that would create a new combatant command for all things drone across the military. It's clear the Trump administration wants to consolidate what had been for the last few years a lot of disparate drone programs across Pentagon offices and the military services. They want it more streamlined. That's one of the reasons there's so much money, $54 billion, dedicated to the Defense Autonomous Warfare Group in the FY27 budget proposal. That's the umbrella program inside the Pentagon overseeing all autonomous assets like drones. And now you'll have a czar, or a portfolio manager, as they call it, to oversee programs that have been all across military service components, the Joint Interagency Task Force 401, the Counter-Drone Task Force, programs in the Defense Innovation Unit, and the Defense Autonomous Warfare Group that I just mentioned. So this individual, who has not yet been named, is going to have a ton of authority over acquisition and basically everything to do with drones and the Pentagon. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how the Trump administration put General Michael Gutlein in charge of everything to do with the Golden Dome missile shield. It does seem the president and Secretary Hegseth like to kind of have one person at the top of that food chain for these really ambitious, sort of game-changing technological movements across defense and national security. Our friend, retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, described this before on the show as wanting to have one throat to choke if things go wrong. And I think that's a fair way to describe it. Speaking of Pete Hegseth and the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary lost another round in court in the ongoing saga over journalists' access to the Pentagon. A federal judge issued an injunction basically blocking the Pentagon from requiring journalists to have an escort to enter the building, saying that attempt was retaliatory. I don't exactly know where that leaves reporters, including myself, who used to go to the Pentagon and really no longer do. The Correspondence Corridor workspace that we used to work out of for years, that I personally worked out of for years, that's been closed. So, physically, it almost seems impossible for things to go back exactly to the way they used to be before. But still, the legal fight's not over, not by a long shot. We'll see where it goes from here. But for now, I want to get to Alex Vatanka, who talked to Vaughn Calkane and me about just every issue you can imagine related to the U.S.-Iran war. And we are joined now by Alex Vatanka, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, who specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs and focuses heavily, especially these days, on Iran. Alex is one of the leading voices in Washington and really in the world on Middle East regional security and all things Iran. He's an accomplished author working on his third book right now, Iran's Arab Strategy, has testified before Congress, and he's our guest today on the Threat Status Podcast. Alex, thanks so much for coming on to talk to Vaughn and me.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation.
So I want to talk big picture here. I know we're going to delve into some more specifics about U.S.-Iran talks and where we stand. But, you know, it feels like a lifetime ago that when I was a White House correspondent during the Obama administration, I covered the lead up and the signing of the JCPOA. And there's kind of been this argument made by folks on the Trump side of the political aisle here that things are a lot different today during this current round of negotiations than they were then. They would say that Iran was ascendant then. Its nuclear program was on the way up, and it felt like it was a rising regional power, and that today they're in a much different position because of the U.S. and Israeli military campaign, negotiating from a position perhaps of weakness. I wonder if the flip side can be true and where you come down on that, because I can see an argument that the regime is still standing, its nuclear program still exists, it still has ballistic missiles. It can obviously still threaten its neighbors and U.S. military bases, as we've seen recently. It stands to get a bunch of money from a potential deal with the U.S. So you take kind of all of these things and put them together. And what do you make of Iran's negotiating position today, its status both as a negotiating partner with the U.S. and its status as a regional power in the Mideast versus where it was 12 years ago or versus where it was 5 months ago?
Right, Ben, let me just, before I sort of focus on the Iranian side of it, let me just very quickly sort of say a few words about the U.S. decision to go to war on the 28th of February. And very, very bluntly, I think, looking back at the last few months of events and where we are, one will be struggling not to conclude that if you decide to go to war, have a plan. Better still, have a good plan. And I don't think that was the case. I think the United States, and what I'm about to say is hardly controversial. That seems to be the consensus in this country right now. Went into war with the country of Iran, a country that has been a pain in the neck for the United States for about half a century, but nonetheless went to war not having a clear-cut mission in mind, but a hope that this is a weak, rotten regime that will collapse from within. That was just not good enough of a strategy, and now we're dealing with the consequences. So where is Iran? Well, Iran right now feels that they have won this war, essentially. And a lot of people around the world feel the same way. Probably a lot of people in the United States, that they won the war. But winning for Iran was always something very specific, which means for them, regime survival. So they weren't aiming for the sky. Regime survival is winning. And they are, as the Islamic Republic, still there in power. And therefore, they can sort of go around and claim to have won. There is another aspect to this, which is that the United States for a long time, before JCPOA that you were talking about, Ben, and going back to the George W. Bush administration of the 2000s, for a long time, the United States put on the option of the use of military force to deal with Iran's nuclear challenge or anything else that Iran threw at America's way. But now that military option has been used, and it didn't break the back of the Iranian regime. And that in many ways is a game changer. Not just how the Islamic Republic looks at the United States, but also in terms of how the world, particularly the Gulf states, others in the Middle East, look at the United States. So yes, you can break things, United States. Your Air Force is great at targeting, and we saw thousands of targets being hit. But if you don't have a strategy, and if you don't have the patience to stay the course, then something is missing. And that's basically where we are right now. The United States is seen by the region as not having the patience, willing to give Iran more than Iran, in the view of many in the region, deserves to get. But the United States is so sensitive to the price of gas and how the stock market performs. And the president is worried about the midterm elections in a few months' time. All this put together has meant that right now, as we speak, here at the beginning of July 2026, and God knows where we'll be in a few hours or a few days' time. But right now, the Iranian side feel that they have time on their side. They don't think Donald Trump's going to resume the war. They feel that they can sort of, if you will, take that global economy hostage at least for a few weeks and months more until they get what they want. And that then remains to be obviously hammered out during these talks that might happen in the next few weeks and months.
Right. It's such a great point, because for how many consecutive presidents have we heard say vis-a-vis Iran, all options are on the table, and the military option was always seen as kind of the end of the line, and now we've used it. So I think that calculation is a lot different. You mentioned this idea that the Trump administration seemed to believe that this was a rotten regime that would collapse from within. How did they end up with that conclusion? Do you think the president got fed essentially bad intel, maybe, I don't know if by Iranian dissident groups or other stakeholders, about what was going to happen in Tehran if the U.S. did this? It seemed like, that video that he put out, feels like a lifetime ago, but on February 28th, I mean, a lot of that was dedicated to, you need to stand up and finally overthrow this regime. We're here for you. All of that. It seemed like he really believed that was going to happen, and that was a miscalculation. How did he make that miscalculation, you think?
Look, Donald Trump didn't really have a plan in terms of helping the Iranian opposition. That became abundantly clear early on in the war, because I think second or third day of the military campaign, he stopped talking about helping the Iranian people. He had good reason to think this is a rotten regime, because Donald Trump wasn't the only one thinking that way. Pretty much the rest of the world that was looking at the Islamic Republic that only in January of this year killed thousands of its own citizens to stay in power. So it's not far-fetched to sort of come to the conclusion that this is a regime that long time ago lost its own people. But that doesn't mean it's not able to kill its way and stay in power. And that's exactly what the regime has done. And that's the part that Donald Trump probably didn't understand sufficiently. Now, who gave him that idea? All the open source reporting out there suggests that one individual, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu of Israel, was a critical voice that walked into the Situation Room and essentially, put all American expertise inside. And in the United States spends billions and billions of dollars every year hiring so many experts who would have told the president, this is not going to happen. This regime is not going to implode. But he decided to go with Bibi. And again, Donald Trump was in a place where he had just had that glorious mission in Venezuela. He had just last summer of 2025, bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, got away with a number of things that he could sort of look at and say, these are easy wins. Why can't I just go ahead and make history? And this becomes my legacy, the American president who brings the Islamic Republic down. But all that essentially amounts to wishful thinking and does not amount to a good, clear-cut strategy going forward. So you can blame Netanyahu, and a lot of people do, and I understand that. But end of the day, it was Donald Trump's call, and the fact that the United States, as a government, as a system, was not able to prevent this from happening.
Alex, real quick, because I know Vaughn wants to jump in here, but on the Netanyahu question, this is so fascinating, and it's a really important point. Do you think that, and I hate to put you in a position to guess what's in somebody's mind, but do you think that Netanyahu and the Israeli government, did they believe 100% that was going to happen, that this regime was going to fall? Or were they just maybe stretching the truth a little bit or stretching their own intelligence a little bit? Because from a policy perspective, Israel really wanted the United States to go to war with Iran.
Look, basic reality is Israel could not have gone to war with Iran without the United States. Iran is not Gaza. Iran is not South Lebanon. Iran is in Syria. Iran is a different league in terms of size and as a challenge for Israel. So they needed the United States. And I think they did stretch the truth. And I think there is, the reporting that's coming out of Israel. Many in Israel, too, were against this idea because they would see the regime not falling like a house of cards, the way Netanyahu told Trump it would happen. And number two, and it turned out to be very good projection, a lot of Israelis thought this is going to undermine the alliance between Washington and Jerusalem, which we're now seeing unfold from front of our eyes. End of the day, I think the Israelis thought we have Donald Trump in the White House another 2.5 years. We might never have another American president this sympathetic to Israel. So why not go ahead, finish the job? And the finishing the job became the slogan of Bibi Netanyahu since October 7th. Again, he has his reasons to make that position. But the reality is he stretched it. He manipulated it. He didn't tell Trump, from what I can tell, the full truth about how this Iranian regime is nasty, yes, but is also entrenched. And, the fact that we had to wake up the day after the war had started and worry about the Strait of Hormuz, my God, how come nobody talked about the Strait of Hormuz and what it means for the global economy before the war started? I don't think Donald Trump would have gone to this war if he had any sense of the significance of the Strait of Hormuz. And I somehow think Netanyahu didn't tell him about that part, or no, perhaps he didn't know about it himself either.
Alex, Von Cockane here. I've been nodding my head a lot along with what you're saying. But to shift us forward a little bit to where we are right now, as many listeners are probably aware, we're right in the middle of a 60-day negotiating period that's outlined in the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran. And Alex, I want to talk specifically about some domestic political divisions in Iran over what's going on in the negotiations. You had a piece in Foreign Policy basically outlining how divided Iran's elites are on the question of where exactly to position themselves in these negotiations. So I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about where the fault lines are, or the factions in Tehran over the negotiations, and how those disagreements over how negotiations should be handled could impact the outcomes over the next few months.
Sure, Vaughn, thanks for that question. Let me very quickly point out, because you mentioned the 60-day period, which is obviously key. Just for the listeners' sake, the ceasefire, if you will, the Memorandum of Understanding was signed on 17th of June. We don't know to this day. I mean, I'm not clear about it. Did the 60 days begin on the 17th of June, or do we have to have another meeting like today or tomorrow before the 60 days start? Because if they started, they've already lost 2 weeks, right? Because by middle of August, there should be some kind of a final agreement. No chance there'll be a final agreement. And President Trump is already talking about extending this. So this could go on for many, many months. I think the president cares about the price of gas going down, as it has in recent days and weeks. He's happy with that. He's not looking for the final agreement. And frankly, he doesn't have to worry too much. I mean, he doesn't have to worry about Iran's nuclear program at this point. What he worries about is the economic impact of this war. And if that is under control, then he's happy, which is exactly what the Iranians have been taking shots at some of the ships going out of the Strait of Hormuz, because they can't have stability to return until something tangible is given to them. And that's where we are. That's where this sort of wrestling match right now is happening. And that takes me to your question about, who says what in Tehran. Basically, you have two camps. And I think it really important for me first to point out the camp that's for diplomacy is by far the largest. I'm talking about inside the Iranian regime. I'm not talking about general population. I'm talking about inside the regime. The pro-diplomacy camp is far larger, but there is a loud, very persistent minority that basically makes the argument you still can't trust the Americans, that this memorandum of understanding is nothing but a sort of plot for the United States to go into rearm and to come back and hit us harder again. So why negotiate with them? Whereas the folks that are doing the talk with Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff, people like Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Parliament, what are they saying? They're saying, listen, we're getting certain things from the Americans. We're getting sanctions relief. The blockade on Iranian ports has already been lifted. 40 million barrels of Iranian oil has already, in the last 2 weeks, been sent to global markets. That's tangible stuff. That shows you diplomacy is working. Don't question it. Don't give up on diplomacy before you've even tried. And they point out the Strait of Hormuz, which is Iran's ace right now, is only valuable as long as there's maritime traffic that goes in and out. But if the Gulf countries and others start diversifying, sending their oil or gas or buying and selling their goods through alternative methods, then what's the value of the Strait of Hormuz anymore? So they're saying don't overplay your hand. And that, I think, is really interesting that that's happening, that discussion is happening within Iran. What they have not made a decision on, and that's really critical looking down the pathway, years to come, is the Islamic Republic, now that Ali Khamenei is dead, is this new set of leaders in Tehran, are they willing to contemplate the basic but consequential idea of normalization of some sort of relations with the United States? because that is basically one of the byproducts of this war. It has created an opportunity where suddenly the Islamic Republic, that has engaged in the sort of death to America slogans for decades, realizes actually it's not just a slogan. It could result in war, in kinetic action, in thousands of Iranian targets being hit and the country being put on the brink of collapse. Maybe we should rethink the whole animosity thing with the United States. That's what J.D. Vance is talking about. When he's talking about Iran and U.S. could go in a different direction, that's a hopeful view, but it is a view that could happen if those so-called pragmatic voices inside the Islamic Republic prevail and put the ideologues who just live with being anti-American, anti-Western, and they don't really have an alternative solution to anything. If you can get those hardliners to part themselves out, then maybe this war in the long term might actually result in something good in the sense of getting Washington to Iran to see themselves as being in a fight that's a lose-lose proposition. Iran can't keep doing this again and again, and the United States shouldn't be distracted by a war in the Middle East when it knows damn well that the rising China is the challenge to focus on.
Yeah, and the other thing that I thought was really interesting that you pointed out in your piece was that the IRGC, which now is, really directing the negotiations, had existed previously as a sort of, as you said, a resistance voice that consistently pointed out the unreliability of the United States, the previous interactions being negative for Iran. So it'll be really interesting to see, where it goes over the next couple of months, as you said. But staying on negotiations really quick, I did want to ask, what are, because you pointed out the complexity of the Strait of Hormuz issue, that it is the Islamic Republic's main leverage point, but everyone else knows that as well. And so these diversity actions could really weaken that leverage point, as you said. What are Iran's sort of main priorities in negotiations? Are there things that have changed over the course of the war from the last period of negotiations that they may be willing to give up or are harder on? Is Iran's survival of the war made it so that whatever deal Iran does get, if they get one at all, it'll be a concession-heavy deal?
The Iranian perspective right now is, again, as I pointed out earlier, Vaughn, is that time is on their side, that Donald Trump doesn't want to resume the war. He's now tasted this and he doesn't want to repeat it. He might, as we read in the papers recently, have meetings with his top military officials about alternative ways of defeating Iran militarily. And I'm sure they're constantly thinking about those plans. But the Iranian reading is that Trump is really reluctant to come back into a conflict. So what Iran does in that situation, and that we're seeing this play out, is, asking for some basic concessions from the U.S. From their point of view, basic. From the point of view, many others are big concessions, including unfreezing of Iranian assets. Some, again, we can talk about the size of Iranian monies around the world, but we're talking, around the $25 billion. These are Iranian monies that are sitting in banks around the world that the United States, because of sanctions, has essentially cut Iran off from. So they want some of that. Then they want to see a process where sanctions are being lifted. And this is where the sort of this war is such a big loss compared to JCPOA. JCPOA was giving Iran sanctions relief specifically to what Iran was willing to do, reducing the size of its nuclear program. Here, Iran's going to get sanctions relief for reopening or help, not obstructing the flow of traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. So now Iran is getting something just because of its geography. Just because it's the country that sits to the north of the Strait of Hormuz, and with a few missiles and drones can take the entire strait hostage for any time it wants to. So in a sense, what I'm trying to tell you is they're in a better position, if you will, in terms of having discovered the value of the strait when it comes to how they can hurt the global economy and how many people they can hurt in the process. Not just the Americans, not just the Gulf countries, the Europeans, the Asians, so forth. So they are now in sort of trying to see how much they can milk it, if you will.
Alex, I've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I know we want to try to cram 2 more in here. And you just mentioned Iran's missiles. I'm curious, when we kind of turn this around and think about what the U.S. should be thinking about concessions-wise from Iran, there's a lot of talk about the nuclear program, some talk about the ballistic missiles program. I haven't heard too much about Iran's drone program. And what we heard from sources at the Washington Times was that was a key reason why President Trump decided not to put ground troops inside of Iran, because we just don't have a plan at the unit tactical level to deal with swarms of Shaheds coming at U.S. Marines or U.S. soldiers. Does Iran realize that is now a leverage point that it has as well, that the United States military recognized that Iran, as kind of a drone power, if you will, holds significant military capabilities because of how many they have and how effective they can be?
That, and the fact that the United States really doesn't want to see many of its forces killed out there for this war. They appreciate it. The Iranian regime will be much more willing to sacrifice thousands and hundreds of thousands, something the United States, no leader in the United States could contemplate do it. So that is definitely something that, counts in their favor, if you will. And, a few months ago, when people talking about United States occupying not Quiche Island, Khark Island, the big oil island in the northern parts of the Persian Gulf. I remember saying, you know how small that island is? If you have forces there, that they become sitting ducks? It's exactly the kind of situation that the hardliners, by the way, in Iran would like to see. American boots on the ground in Iran.
Alex, just to close us out here, I did want to ask about the so-called axis of resistance and where it stands during these negotiations and after, in your view. Obviously, China and Russia being Iran's two largest state allies. But looking beyond that to Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, which became pretty instrumental during this war, as well as other conflicts in the past, that organization of proxy networks came about during one of the most intense periods of U.S. and Western sanctions on Iran. How does Iran's relationship with Hezbollah, with Hamas and the Houthis, as well as China and Russia, look after a deal is made or after this war in general?
So, Vaughn, in the short term, I suspect the Iranian regime will do what it can to preserve as much of the axis as possible, at least in words, if not in action. We're seeing them insisting on Israel pulling out of Lebanon. We're seeing them insist that, U.S. should not demand the disarmament of Hezbollah because, Hezbollah is an Iranian partner, ally, whatever you want to call it. So I see that Iranian approach being with us in the short term, certainly when these negotiations are happening. But in the longer term, what happens to Iran's sponsorship of proxies, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, really goes back to the question of who wins the policy argument in Tehran. It takes me back to the Henry Kissinger argument. Is Iran an ideological cause or a nation state? If they choose to be a nation state, then right now you have no reason to want to bank on the proxies anymore. The whole idea of sponsoring proxies was they keep war away from Iran. That you fight the Israelis in Lebanon or the Americans, you fight them somewhere else. But the war came to the skies of Tehran, and the proxies couldn't stop it. And that raises fundamental questions in terms of what's best deterrence. Are the proxies the best deterrence? Or maybe negotiating with the Americans, having red lines with the Israelis, maybe that's a better deterrent. So I think there's going to be a lot of hard thinking having to happen in an Islamic Republic, because the proxy model of the last 20 years, post 2003, when the U.S. went into Iraq, where the proxy model was born, today, we're in a very different place, and I can't predict its future, but I can tell you it's being discussed, I'm sure, very intensely as we speak in corridors of power in Tehran.
Alex Vatanka from the Middle East Institute, thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status podcast. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. And my threat of the week is this apparent China-backed effort to stop the construction of new data centers in the United States, which, by the way, is working, or at least seems to be. Our colleague Bill Gertz dove deep into new claims that the opposition to data centers is being funded in part by a China-based American tycoon who is funneling millions of dollars to the U.S. communist group Party for Socialism and Liberation, which in turn is running a sophisticated influence campaign to drum up anti-data center sentiment. You can read Bill Gertz's fantastic piece in the Washington Times to learn more about this individual. But these bombshell claims come from a new report in the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And apparently this effort and the subsequent actions, the influence campaigns by the Party for Socialism and Liberation, have led to about $23 billion in delayed or blocked funding for data centers. 4 data center projects were dropped. 10 local governments imposed construction moratoria, and 1 data center was permanently banned, according to this Bitcoin Policy Institute. Data centers, of course, or server farms, as a lot of people call them, are these large complexes needed to process the huge amounts of data that powers artificial intelligence models and other modern tech that we all kind of use here in the 21st century. China is building those data centers. And it's clear they don't want us to, and you can certainly start to connect the dots as to why that is, because they want to dominate the advanced military tech weapons race. They want to dominate AI. They want to dominate all of that. And this is potentially a small to medium-sized cog, but an important cog in that broader effort. So just keep that in mind. I'm by no means suggesting that there aren't legitimate reasons to raise questions about data centers. There certainly are. There are a lot of questions about, number one, the aesthetic of having this in your neighborhood, 2, water concerns, how much power they can use. Is it going to drive electricity bills higher for average Americans all across the country? There's a lot here to unpack, but do keep in mind that if you start to see, a lot of sort of anti-data center sentiment being expressed on Facebook or social media, a lot of that could be traced back to China-linked individuals or groups who are essentially working overtime to drum up opposition in the United States. So again, I'm not suggesting there's no grassroots opposition to data centers. There clearly is, but at least some of that seems to be linked directly to China, and they want you to oppose those data centers. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And with that, a huge thanks to Vaughn Calkane for joining me for that great interview with Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute. Alex was fantastic, as he always is, one of my favorite folks in D.C. to talk to. So thank you, Alex, and most of all, thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all your friends, and we'll be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.